Welcome to Underdog Rising with your host, Wade Posehn, where we ignite your journey from humble beginnings to greatness through inspiring tales of top executives and entrepreneurs. In this episode of Underdog Rising, we have Dr. Marette Hahn. She is the Honors College Director at Grand Canyon University, and she is a Doctor of Philosophy with a PhD in Industrial and Organizational Psychology. Marette, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
So we're going to jump into a quick fire round. What's the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
So I have to say this came from a podcast episode, actually, from Gretchen Rubin. And she said, whenever you're facing a difficult decision, ask yourself, what would give me the bigger life? So choose the bigger life.
Wow, that's so profound. I like that.
I know, simple but profound, right?
Yeah. And then what's your favorite productivity hack?
So I have a bunch of weird little things I do. I don't necessarily have a great system. I joke around because I'm not actually overly organized, although I think most people think I am. So I do a lot of sticky notes, but a lot of emailing myself. So for me, my email is my to-do list. So if it's unread, that means I still have to do something with it. And so oftentimes if I think of things in the middle of the night or whatever, I'll just email myself.
That's very unique. I have never heard that before, but I like that strategy though. I think it's a very, because then it'll be top of your inbox the very next day and you know to get it done.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting. And name a book that has had a profound impact on you.
I can't name just one, so I'll break the rules a little bit and do two. One is Dare to Lead by Brené Brown, and the other is Hidden Potential by Adam Grant.
Any specific reason as to why those have had a big impact on you?
So Hidden Potential focuses a lot on perfectionism and battling perfectionism. So I think that's pretty on point for a lot of people, myself included. And I do have to say, though, I listened to that one via audiobook, and so I'm dying to actually read it myself. I feel like I'll absorb more of it once I read it. But the other one, Dare to Lead, I did read, and that one for me was really about learning how to lead authentically and being okay with who I am and figuring out what my style of leadership is.
I think that's very impactful. And I think, those that are listening today should definitely check out those books. What is one thing you wish you knew earlier in your career?
That's a great question. I think it's okay to be yourself and to ask for help. That's going to be a theme today, I think, is asking for help. So we'll get there later, but I wish I would have learned how to ask for help earlier.
No, I think that's brilliant. Everyone should not be afraid of asking for help, right? No question is a stupid question. Describe a defining moment in your career in one word.
In one word would be accept.
Nice. I want to dive probably into that a little bit later. What's your go-to method for handling stress?
My typical go-to method for handling stress is some kind of activity, so movement of some kind. Typically, I have a 1-year-old right now, so I'm not as exercise focused as I want to be or should be, but typically it would be something like going for a mountain bike ride or going hiking or for a run or something like that.
That's great. I think people need to identify those ways that they can de-stress because it is important, because life can get so busy and stressful in many different ways, right? Just besides work. Name a skill you're working on to improve right now.
I've been working on this one for 6 years and still working on it. Delegation.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think for me too. What's your favorite way to stay motivated?
So I typically have a personality where I'm just motivated. I always want to do my best in everything I do. If I'm finding myself lacking motivation for some reason, usually I just have to take a break and then come back refocused.
Yeah, rejuvenate it and then get back into it. Nice. And then what's one goal that you're determined to achieve this year?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit with this one because I actually just achieved it.
Nice. Congrats.
Thank you. So I just had an article get published in the Journal of Scholarly Engagement.
I'm going to give you another congratulations. That is really cool. Nicely done.
Thank you.
And then what's the first thing you do in the morning to start your day?
Yes. So typically pre-baby, that would have been some kind of workout. Right now, I'm prioritizing sleep when I do get it. And so now actually the best way I can start my day is, whether it's my husband going in first or if I go in first, some kind of interaction with my daughter. to make sure I have that touch point in the morning before anything else happens for the day.
Yeah, I think that's very special, and it's important, right? Because it is needed, because we could step right into work and then we kind of get pulled away for a little bit. So Merritt, if you don't mind, just for the listeners today, please can you give us a summary of your career journey from where you started to where you are today?
Sure. So it's a little bit of an interesting path. I think people who meet me now and see me now might be surprised to find out that originally I had zero interest in going to college, which is funny because now I have a doctorate and I work in higher education. Well, so there you go. But my very, very, very first job, it was technically off the record, but I worked at a salon. So my mom started going to the salon when I was in middle school or so. And so by the time I started driving and needed to make some money to pay for gas and all that fun stuff, I needed some kind of job. And there wasn't a lot available for 16-year-olds, at least at that time. So luckily, the lady who ran the salon said, well, hey, you can come just help me keep the salon clean and I'll pay you cash. And here we go. So I said, okay. And I loved hair and doing hair at that point. I always had fun playing with my friends' hair, especially for dances and that sort of thing. So I was dead set on going to cosmetology school. And my mom said, well, that's great. You can do that if you want, but you're going to college first. Oh, okay. Sounds good. So I had to, my junior year, start thinking about colleges and had never really considered what I would study or what I wanted to do outside of going to cosmetology school. So I found a college about half an hour from my hometown that I absolutely fell in love with and entered undecided. Had no idea what I wanted to study, but the only courses I enjoyed were psychology courses. So eventually I did declare psychology as my major, still having no idea what I wanted to do. But I slowly started getting really involved on my campus, and I absolutely fell in love with the different roles I had, most of which were mentor oriented. So serving in some kind of mentor role. And I just loved all of them. And so much so that my schedule was absolutely insane and ridiculous, but I found that I actually performed better in school when I was busier. So there's that. And eventually I decided, I graduated with my degree in psychology. I initially decided I didn't want to go on for a master's degree, which what are you supposed to do with psychology when you don't have a master's or a counseling license or anything like that? And I also graduated during the recession in 2009. So a lot of people had difficulty finding jobs. I actually remember going out to lunch or dinner with my then boyfriend, now husband, and he had graduated a year earlier than me. And one of his buddies ended up serving us at a restaurant, and we talked to him, and he was working multiple part-time jobs just to try and make ends meet. But I was really fortunate in that some of my friends from college were working at an online university, and they were able to refer me. So if anybody doesn't know what that means, essentially they were already employed there. And when a job opening pops up, they can essentially submit you to be considered for a role. So I was fortunate. They referred me. I got the position. So I started working at another university, which was great because I wanted to stay in higher education by that point. I had figured that out. I loved being involved so much that I never wanted to leave. So I started there in a very entry-level position, moved into an academic advisor position, started my master's because I had an education benefit, and why not? But I knew I didn't want licensure, so I pursued a master's in studies in human behavior. And then about a year into being an academic advisor, my husband's job took us to Arizona from Minnesota, and I had to start all over. So new network, new people, new job, everything. So I started in online enrollment at Grand Canyon University, did that for about 10 months, then transitioned into career advising. So I became a career advisor in career services. And then from there, I just got the opportunity to work and collaborate with different people across campus. And I bounced around in different departments, and now I'm in the Honors College as the director.
What an incredible journey. I mean, it's, from where you were in Minnesota to now being at GCU and the position that you currently hold at GCU, but also not wanting to go to college. And now you're so deep within the higher education system. It's so fascinating how different journeys will flow, But before we dive into everything, what inspires you to do what you do?
So I think pretty much everybody, at least hopefully everybody, has that one teacher, right? That one teacher who impacted you in some way, shape, or form. And so I was fortunate enough to have a few, but I had two in particular when I was really young, when I was going through major life changes. One, I was moving states, and the other, I was going through my parents' divorce. So I had two teachers play really pivotal roles at those times. And some of the things I was dealing with, my self worth was pretty low. And they were people who came in and said, I see you, you're valuable, I hear you, I'm here for you, and I know that you're capable of doing great things. And ever since those two teachers kind of passed through my life journey, I've always wanted to make sure the people I encounter, I try and at least help them feel some level of the same way if I can. And it's always been education, I guess, even though I didn't see it at the time. It's always been some form of education, teachers, again, that mentorship type role. So for me, it was really trying to make sure I pass that on, right? I could never repay them. So instead, how can I pay it forward?
I really enjoy that because when you're in those leadership positions, or if you're at any level within the higher education system, there is such an opportunity to influence the younger minds that are going to grow up to be the future leaders, and they can be very moldable. So I appreciate you walking through that. And one thing that came up as you were explaining that I'd like to ask, what would you say to those who are not sure on what to study but will be going into college?
Great question. Like I said, I had no idea. I think I sat in the undecided status for 2 years. I think they cut you off eventually. And I was like, okay, I have to select something. And so I would recommend most colleges, universities, if it's community college, if it's a 4-year, whatever it is, most schools should have some kind of career services office. And as part of career services, they should have some kind of career advising, most likely some kind of assessment to help you identify what you're interested in, what motivates you, what drives you, that sort of thing. So I would recommend that to get started. And then after that, honestly, just try all the things. Go try something. If there's something that intrigues you, even in the absolute least, like just a little trickle of, I wonder about that, go try it. There's nothing wrong with giving something a try, and you might find something you love that you had no idea. I did not grow up outdoorsy at all. My husband started mountain biking because the guys he worked with started mountain biking. He was like, I think you might like this. I said, okay. And we love it. So you just have to go out there and try things. And that's the other way you'll try and figure out what really inspires you and what lights that fire. Because up until this point, you most likely don't have a ton of experience. And so really college is that time to just give it a whirl.
You're so spot on. We need to experiment with different elements of study so that we can know what will pique our interest. Because if we don't, we're always going to be undecided. But it's very interesting to see the path that you've taken from not wanting to go to college to being heavily involved. But the psychology has really, I think, helped position you to where you are today within GCU, which is absolutely incredible. And then influenced by those that had helped shape your mindset. And now you're giving back to those students in that same fashion as well.
I can also say, just one thing I've noticed, as I mentioned earlier, I spent a few years in career advising, and a lot of students I met with selected their major because their parents told them to.
So would you recommend to avoid that?
Yes. So, I mean, the number of students I would talk to, oh yeah, my parents want me to be a lawyer, they want me to be a doctor, and I hate blood. Well, you're the one that has to live that every day. So is that really what you want to do? I mean, the years and the money and the schooling, you're the one that's going to have to live that life and get up and go to that job every single day. You're the one that has to live with the consequence of that decision.
And that's where I think it ties back into your earlier point about acceptance and accepting who you are and what you would like to do in life. And I think so often generations ahead of the current generations that are actually going through studies or college put those individuals into a box, set their limitations instead of allowing them to be open and free and experiment to truly identify what they would love to do and have a passion for. So within higher education, most institutions will have a career services program or element to it. And there's a lot of other programs, and you were heavily involved in a lot of them as well in your past. Is it beneficial for college students to get involved in those college programs today?
Absolutely. So I know, at least in the higher education space, on the administrative side, which is what I'm on, there's a lot of conversation about our students thinking college is still worth it, our parents thinking college is still worth it, right? The time commitment, the financial commitment, all these different pieces. But from my perspective, there's so much learning and growth that happens during college outside of the classroom. And some of that is just in your day to day interactions with friends or roommates. And now you're trying to problem solve and communicate and come up with resolutions, right? But then once you get involved, you have so many more opportunities to grow and flourish in different ways. So you take on a leadership role in a club, for example, or you become a resident advisor, which is kind of like a mentor on a dorm floor or an apartment floor, or you become an orientation leader, which is to help new students transition into the university or whatever it might be. There are so many different options. And in many ways, it's a job. You can put that on your resume. You're responsible for showing up and acting in a professional manner and being on time and all those kind of basic, quote unquote, basic professionalism skills. But then in addition, you're leading people, you're conducting conflict resolution conversations, you're problem solving, you're challenging people, you're leading people, you're being a team player. I mean, there are so many incredible professional skills you'll build in these different experiences. And I think even the students I work with now who are in all of these things, they don't even realize that's what they're doing. It drives me nuts. We're talking about their resume, and it's like, do you not understand all the incredible skills you can put on your resume because you're doing X, Y, and Z? So it's such a great way to build your resume, build your experience, polish up your skills. It's just an incredible opportunity to learn and grow.
It's also a wonderful way to network and start building relationships, because that will be advantageous to the individual once they also get further out in their career, right? To your point, how you were referred, that can always happen throughout your career. So in that environment, you're building that. And then to your point about, updating your resume and them not being aware of what they're building or working on while they're in college, I think for college graduates and folks in college, it's all about adjusting their mindset and how they see things. And then taking that and putting it on your resume in such a way that it accentuates like your skills and what you're learning on campus. No, to your point, you're going through conflict resolution conversations. Somebody might not see it that way because they're like, I'm just having a conversation. So how is that valid? But let's change how you see that and then put that on your resume, and then it'll add value. And somebody in the corporate world will love that because now you've got soft skills.
Exactly. I think sometimes what students don't understand is if it's something that comes easily to them, they don't even realize they're doing it. So helping them understand that just because you don't even think twice about it doesn't mean it's not a skill. It is a skill because there are other people who don't have it. And one of my favorite questions to ask students is, have you ever met somebody who's not good at following directions? And they all laugh because they've all met somebody who's not good at following directions. Like, believe it or not, that is a skill because some people can't do it. So even just helping them understand some of those basics, and that even though you don't think about it, it's still a skill.
That's really great. Because of your background in psychology, you're able to help change their focus and see things very differently, which is very impactful on that younger generation. And it's, when we look at networking and also building relationships, that you can also identify mentors on campus, right? That can also, to your point, help guide you. Others help shape you as well throughout your life. So I'd like to transition and ask you, have there been any significant mentors or influences in your life that have helped and guided you through your personal and professional development?
Absolutely. So, of course, it started with those teachers, but moving more so into the work world, my first real boss was I worked at Caribou Coffee in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And some people have heard of that, some people haven't. In Minnesota, it's a big competitor with Starbucks. But so I worked at Caribou, and I had a really incredible manager, Jenna. And at one point, she was actually getting evaluated to become what would potentially be a training manager. So she would train other aspiring managers. And so there was this whole process we had to go through to try and make sure we got a good evaluation for the store and for her. And I remember she mentioned something about one of her colleagues at the manager level asking her, well, aren't you scared that these people you're training are going to take your job? And she said, if they did, that would be the best compliment.
What an interesting way to look at that. I love it.
Right. And so that was literally my first window into servant leadership. And that always stuck with me. So that was when I was maybe 18 years old, something like that. So then I transitioned into college where I worked for some really incredible people as a student worker, one being Brenda. And she was the type of person who would hold you accountable and push you and challenge you, but see you as well.
That's very important.
Yes, she knew if you were having a bad day, struggling, whatever the case may be. And I'll never forget, I was coming in I had to do a trial tour. I was becoming a tour guide. And so I had to give my final tour to a staff member to kind of test me basically and make sure I could actually do it. And I was so nervous. I mean, literally, shaking and feeling like I'm going to pass out level of nervous. And so I walked in and she could tell right away that I was not doing well. And she said, hey, I need this to go down to the mail center. Can you take this down for me? Because she just knew I needed something to do, something else to focus on and to move, basically. And so that was her level of being in tune with her people and watching out for them. And then I passed the tour and I became a tour guide. So she was great. And there's so many other incredible stories from her. She actually called her Mama B. So she's incredible. And to this day, I still reach out to her when I go back to Minnesota and we still get together.
That's incredible.
Yeah, she's amazing. And then my first boss out in the quote unquote real world. So after I graduated and got my first big girl job, my first boss was RT, and he was more of like a life coach, basically. So the job itself was pretty straightforward and simple. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a pretty motivated person, so I'm going to show up and do my best. And so most of the time in our one-on-ones or meetings, we just talked about life and where I wanted to go and my goals. And sometimes I would talk to him about personal things going on as well. And he coached me through a lot of those things, but he's also a football coach. So he brought kind of that sports performance mentality to a lot of things. And I'll never forget, he said, Marette, you just do things the right way. And at the time, I was like, what are you talking about? I don't understand. What other way would I do them? I didn't understand. And it wasn't until a lot later when I got my very first formal leadership position where I had people reporting to me that I understood what he meant. Because not everybody does things the right way.
It's interesting because, mentors do play a big element in people's lives, but even going a little further back, you were a trio peer mentor in college. Like, can you explain what that is a little bit more and why it was so pivotal in your academic and career path?
So I grew up in the Midwest, in the suburbs, where everybody looked the same, thought the same, carried themselves the same, houses all looked everything looked the same. And I did not enjoy that overly. So I intentionally chose an urban college. So I went to school literally in downtown Minneapolis. I absolutely loved it. It challenged me in a lot of different ways, worldviews, perspectives, everything. But being a trio peer mentor was what really expanded my worldview and expanded my cultural awareness and so many different things. So it's been impactful on a life level, not just an academic or a career level. But essentially, TRIO is a government grant-funded program offered at tons of schools across the country for underrepresented and first generation and low socioeconomic status students who are trying to go to college. So because these students haven't had anybody else in their families experience higher education, a lot of times they're at a disadvantage for a whole bunch of different reasons. But I became a mentor for a 5-week bridge program over the summer. So they came on campus, took 2 college courses over the summer before their freshman year, and I was responsible for running things like their study hall and whatnot, but then also social activities, some team building activities, those kinds of things, and then just being there for them. But it was such a life altering experience because, as I mentioned previously, I didn't have an original interest in going to college. My mom made me go to college. And actually, not that long ago, I busted out my old high school yearbook and I found tucked into it our high school newspaper. And on the back page of the newspaper, it had all the colleges, all the graduates were going to. Like, it was just, that's what you did. You just went to college, never questioned. So then here I am facing, there's about 30 students who are all very different from me, different backgrounds. And I'm just listening to their stories about what they overcame just to get to that point. So things like parents not being involved or working multiple jobs. So they're getting up early, going to a job, then going to school, then coming home, helping their siblings with homework, maybe fitting in their homework somewhere, and then going off to some other job at night because they're required to help pay the bills, buy groceries, whatnot. And I'm sitting here like, I was told to go to college, right? So for me, it was a master class in, okay, there are different experiences out there in the world, and not everybody has the same upbringing as me. And as naive as that sounds, I had no idea because I'd never experienced anything else before or witnessed or been friends with anybody different than me. So it really shocked my worldview quite a bit, but it also gave me a lot of respect and appreciation for the stories of everybody going to school and gratitude for my background and where I came from. And so from there, I really became focused on how do I level the playing field. It's it's not a given for everyone, and I think it should be. The opportunity to better yourself, the opportunity to earn a degree so you can get into XYZ career should be available to everybody. So that's been kind of the underlying goal I've had in my various roles. Eventually, I'd like to focus on that more, but right now, I just try and do what I can from where I can because I have a platform I can use. So I'm trying to actually do my dissertation on first generation college students and academic help seeking, which goes back to my original statement about having a difficult time asking for help. But I wanted to figure out how can we better support them when they're actually in college because it takes a lot to get there, but then getting them through is a whole other ballgame.
It's always about the next step, right? How do we do that handoff and how do they sort of assimilate to that new lifestyle and situation? And I know you mentioned through all that you weren't on sort of the equal playing field as those because you were you were told to go to college, but at points throughout your career you had challenges yourself, right? Such as like relocations and job changes, and that altered your own career path. But you've always chosen a positive mindset. And we could hear that in what you were talking about a little bit earlier. Why is that? And what can people take away from always working on their mindset?
I don't know if you're familiar with fixed and growth mindset, but I was not until I was in my master's program, and I actually wrote a paper on motivation and distance learning. And that was my first encounter with fixed and growth mindset. If you're interested, there is another book I would recommend. It's literally just called Mindset by Carol Dweck. But basically, she and her team are the ones who've kind of coined this concept and brought it from academia into quote unquote real life so people can apply it. But basically, it's saying people with a fixed mindset believe that their intelligence, their ability is all fixed. So whatever they were born with is just what they have. So no amount of additional effort is going to make a difference. Whereas growth mindset, people believe feedback and effort are all required to continue improving. And so I had never heard any of this until I'm literally writing this paper and I come across her research. And I realized I was raised basically with a fixed mindset. Probably wasn't intentional, but when you're told things like, oh, you're so smart, or oh, you're so talented, right? It reinforces this concept of, oh, I was born with this. So then all of a sudden, when you start to get some sort of resistance or something's difficult, oh, I don't want to push because I'm supposed to be smart. So if this is hard, maybe this just isn't for me. And so for me, that really kept me from trying a lot of new things or pushing myself or taking on challenges, or I would just back off And like I started high school in honors and had a difficult time. So I eventually didn't do honors anymore. I never did AP in high school, which is funny too. Although I did honors in college, so I don't know. But so I learned about this in my master's program. And one of the lines in the book, she's talking about working with kids learning math. And she's trying to help them embrace this growth mindset instead of the fixed mindset. And she said, you might not understand this concept yet, but everybody always forgets the yet, or they don't get that far. And that blew my mind. And so literally from that moment on, I said, you know what? I can choose a growth mindset every day. I will say my default when I'm stressed or overtired or whatever the case may be, sick, whatever, my default is still a fixed mindset in many cases. But I wake up every day and I try to choose a growth mindset. Sometimes my husband will remind me that I'm not in a growth mindset. But I actually got on Etsy, thank goodness for Etsy, I got a sign made that just says yet, and it sits on my desk. So it's my reminder. If I ever start in that fixed mindset spiral, I just look at that, and that's my reminder to embrace that positive mindset.
Very powerful. I think you should start that and like sell it for everybody because it is true. The reframing your mental state of mind is so important because 90% of life is in our head. You know, whether we see things, the perceptions of things, whether life happens to us or for us, it's we have the ultimate control of that, right? And we can control sort of, if you will, the universe in which we live in, right? Just because we were born sort of in one universe or way of life doesn't mean that we can't get to another state, right? And we can change that through what you mentioned about the growth mindset. And that kind of goes into comfort zones of things, right? And you've been pushed out of your comfort zone in your own career path. So, do you have advice to share with college students on why it's good to be pushed outside of one's comfort zone?
So much, so much. First and foremost, I wholeheartedly believe everybody should have to move away from home at least once.
I fully agree with you. I know for some people it might be hard, right, for other reasons, but I agree with you.
Literally, it forces you, you have to figure it out on your own. And you have to be able to try new things and so on and so forth. So I could go on probably a whole other podcast episode about that. But that would be my first thing. But truly outside of that, for example, I grew up extremely introverted and extremely shy. I mean, painfully shy. Like when I got called on in class in, high school or whatever, I mean, just beet red, like literally just kind of melt into the floor and just, yeah. And so I painfully shy. And then it came time in college where in some of those roles I mentioned, I was really good one-on-one, but then I had to start speaking in front of groups, especially for tour guide stuff or admissions, things like that. And so I remember being so petrified and literally feeling like I'm going to throw up, being so nervous. And I just had to do it. I literally just had to do it. A, my job required it. And then B, it's like I'm not going to learn if I don't do it. And it's crazy because ever since then, my roles have increasingly required me to speak in front of people.
And that's the number one fear in the world is public speaking. A lot of people are nervous to do it. And it's just impressive to see how you able to push yourself, right? But it's almost those situations came where you just had to step out and just do it. And that's sometimes the only way you can overcome it. Like there are lessons such as Toastmasters, et cetera, that you can go and do. But what is behind all that? It's repetition. It's getting up in front of people. It's speaking, putting yourself out there. It's being comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Oh, my boss says that all the time. Yep.
You just have to do it, And I just think that it touches on a question I did want to ask you. So, how did you shift out of being an introvert that now you're in a leadership role?
Yes. So, I'm still introvert through and through. So, for anybody who's not familiar with introvert and extrovert, it's all about where you get your energy from and what drains you. So, I'm still an introvert through and through. I get my energy from one-on-one, intimate, deep conversations where we talk about life and we explore all the things, or some kind of rejuvenation for me. Like I love reading, or something where I'm doing something on my own. Like when I was really into running for a while, that was a really great recharge time for me. I get drained where I have to network or, it's the surface level conversation, or a lot of presenting. So public speaking, that can drain me if it's consistent back to back for a while, because I've had to do some of those. That can drain me. And so I just have to make sure I always go back and rejuvenate. For extroverts, they tend to get their energy from other people and from being in these social environments. Like I will never forget my boss when I was originally in career services, huge extrovert. I'm a huge introvert. At the end of a stressful week, he's going to a concert. He's like, get me. I need the energy. I need the people. I need. And I'm sitting there listening to him like, I just want to go home and read a book. So it's just about how you recharge. But I will say it can be really challenging being a leader in a formal leadership role where you've got people pulling on you from both above and below in terms of the hierarchy. And I just had to really make sure I took care of myself and had those recharge times. But I also had to push myself too, right? So introversion and shyness are not necessarily the same thing, although I think oftentimes people who are shy tend to be introverts, or I guess are maybe more likely to be introverted. But so for me, I had to determine, am I shy or am I needing a recharge as an introvert right now? And the shyness is just a social anxiety. So how do I push through that social anxiety? How do I push through whatever the fear is I'm making up in my head, which is, I'm going to be judged poorly or whatever the case may be. And so I really had to honestly just sit there and push myself and for me, dealing with those stressful situations, a lot of it is the mental chatter. So if I can get in control of my mental chatter, then I can push through the uncomfortable and either get out of the comfort zone or try something new or whatever the case may be. So sometimes it's literally just recognizing, okay, my mental chatter is really my social anxiety kicking in right now. I need to get that in check so I can take that step and go do that thing that scares me.
I just recently had a conversation with Dr. Oleg Konovalov, and he's a leadership speaker as well. And he talks about how we have storms in our life, and sometimes there's chaos out in the world, but we have to, in order to calm that chaos, we have to calm the chaos within ourselves. And I think that that's also what you're touching on there. That's very important. We have to know how we can go back and recharge, because we're all different and it all happens in their own unique way. At that time that you were, coming out into more leadership roles and taking on those larger responsibilities within your career, that was also, the industry was dominated mostly by males and, outspoken women. Was that a challenge within itself for you? And how did you maybe work through that?
Yes. So I've had kind of an interesting, I guess, relationship with the concept of leadership for a while. I never grew up picturing myself as a leader, even considering becoming a leader was an option for me, because the only examples of leadership I ever saw were either men or women who were acting like men. And I was neither. And I'm probably your more stereotypical, nurturing, emotional, highly empathetic female.
Operating in your female energy more so than your masculine energy, because individuals have both, right? Whether it's more masculine and feminine, but one tends to rule over the other.
Yes, so I'm definitely more on the feminine side of things. And I do think some of it, honestly, is related to where I grew up and where I was raised. There's a culture, I think, in the Midwest, just Minnesota nice is an actual thing. And so being raised with that, you're expected to be nice to everyone and not ruffle feathers or have too many needs. Heaven forbid you actually have a need, right? So there are all these messages I received growing up that didn't necessarily lend to me turning into some kind of leader, at least the way I saw leaders exist at the time. And I actually remember when I got my director position, one of my program managers at the time, we were still getting to know each other. And she said, it's so nice seeing a nice woman get a leadership position. And I was like, okay, I mean, yeah, I get it. But it's kind of sad, I guess, if you think about it. I think we all assume that leaders have to be this assertive, aggressive, dominant personality, but I've learned, I think actually as an introvert, I have different superpowers that just allow me to lead in a different way. So for me, I'm a listener first. So I'm going to listen to my team, my people, my customers or clients or whoever it is. In my case, often students. So I'm going to listen first. I'm going to build relationships. I'm better at the one-on-one connections, as I mentioned earlier. And so I really tend to connect with the people I try and lead. I'm not able to connect with everyone. I've had my issues and I've had my instances where leadership styles just didn't work. But in general, I think most people know if I'm leading them that I have their best interest at heart. They can come to me with anything. And because I pay attention to a lot of things rather than being more on the outgoing side of things, I'm pretty good at pulling different pieces of information together from different areas and coming up with creative solutions. So I think for me, that's where my introversion comes in as a superpower in my leadership, even though it might have to make up for some other things I don't have. But I've also had to learn to step it out of my comfort zone and figure out how do I present something in a confident, what I would consider dominant way, but probably just to other people more of a confident way. And so it's been a balance of learning new skills while also not losing who I am.
And that ties nicely into your acceptance right at the beginning of the episode. And, you are still obviously a woman in the workforce, but as being a woman in the workforce, like what advice do you have for fellow women who will be stepping out into that environment?
So first and foremost, if you're getting ready to enter the workforce, negotiate your salary. That was one thing people told me, but I had no idea how to do it. I absolutely did not have the skills to try and do that for myself at the time. But it can absolutely alter the trajectory of how much you're able to make over your lifetime. So negotiate your salary. If you don't know how, ask for help, ask career services, whoever, but get help figuring out how to negotiate your salary. And part of that is understanding your worth. And so that will take some, it's going to take some self-work, but it will also take some research, right? Understanding, okay, here's what my degree is. Here's the experience I have because I got involved in college, hopefully. And so I'm not necessarily entering completely blank slate, no experience. You should be able to enter with some kind of experience and be able to negotiate up. So that would be one thing. The other thing I would say is make sure you connect with other women in your workplace or at least just in the workforce somewhere, and preferably a combination of people who are somewhat on your same level and then people who are ahead of you. So people who have been there can share some of their learnings along the way to help you maybe avoid some pitfalls, but then also just help pour into you and help guide you as well. And I have used mine as pace setters. I actually learned that on the Gretchen Rubin podcast as well, which is find someone you really look up to who you feel like you can do similar things and use them as a pace setter. So if they accomplish something, maybe you start working towards something similar. So actually my current boss is my pace setter. So she completed her doctorate. So I went and completed mine. And so I use her as an example of someone I look up to. And so I try and work toward a lot of similar things as long as they make sense for who I am, but a lot of similar things to make sure I'm challenging myself.
Challenging oneself is what we always need to do. And I think that is a great point that you touched on, because having somebody else be a pace setter will also set you up for a lot of successes in your life, because you're identifying that, oh, somebody's achieving something, I need to go achieve something. So it always keeps you on your toes and keeps you pushing forward. What advice do you have for women on work-life balance, right? Especially starting out as a woman in the corporate world.
I don't know that I have this figured out. And I will say it changes based on what you have going on in your life. So early on, my entry-level positions were pretty much, I went to work, I logged off at the end of the day, shut my computer, and that was it. I didn't stress about anything or think about anything after that. Once you climb the ladder a little bit and you take on more responsibility, possibly a leadership role, some of it starts to bleed, right? So now you're checking your emails before you go to bed at night or on weekends, or you're taking phone calls after hours, or you're stressing about things even though the workday is over. And some of that is just the level of responsibility you have now. And I I put in my time. Because I was young and motivated, and at the time I didn't have kids early on. I I was the one that signed up nights, weekends, whatever it was. I'm there. So I put in a lot of time, made some sacrifices there. Granted, I had a unique situation where my husband was also working crazy hours. So for us, it worked. And so I put in my time. And then eventually, I will say, in my personal experience, when I took on my first formal leadership role, I was in an unhealthy state because I was still in that I need to do everything. I'm an individual contributor type mindset. And I didn't ever want to ask people who reported to me to do something I wasn't willing to do. And so for some reason in my brain, just kept thinking I had to do it all. And so I ended up basically almost burning myself out. And I finally had to learn the hard way to delegate, which I'm still learning, as I mentioned earlier. But also starting to recognize now that I have a child at home, when I get home, she has to be my first priority. I have to be present for her. I have to be able to turn off whatever I'm stressed out about at work so I can focus on her and be present for her. And if that means then later after she goes to bed, I log back on or I check my email or whatever, okay, great. Could I get better in that area? Probably. So I think also just understanding what your priorities are. I have an incredible boss who's very focused on work-life balance and making sure that we're available for family. So don't underestimate who you work for, whether it's the organization or the person specifically. She is very, very intentional about the time we spend at work. She's focused and disciplined when we're at work. And then she's also trying to be very aware and cognizant of the asks she's making of us outside of typical work hours. In higher ed, you're always going to be working at some point on a night or a weekend. It's just part of the industry. But she is trying to be intentional about it and making sure it's not all of us all the time.
That's wonderful. And that's a big point that younger generations need to hone in on is when you go into the interview process, you're also interviewing that corporation, right? It's not because at times people will they will jump at the first opportunity, and rightfully so. They're getting into the workforce. There's a lot of layoffs that occur. So, the job market can be pretty stressful when trying to search for a role. But to your point earlier about negotiating salary, you also have to ask, what is the work-life balance? What is the culture like at the corporation so that you find a company that fits and suits you, right? Even tying into your introvert, extrovert topics you were touching on earlier. And you also mentioned, right, like things change when you have a kid and the kid becomes a priority. So a question I've never really asked before, but is extremely relevant because people get married young all the time. How significant is the role of a life partner in influencing and supporting your career journey?
Oh, yes. I love this question. In my experience, extremely influential. So, as I mentioned, as we've talked about, I wasn't necessarily focused on a career or education or anything like that outside of I wanted to do hair, right? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing hair. I want to make that very clear. But I, ended up on this path I wasn't expecting because my mom forced me to. And through that experience, I met my husband. So we met young. I was 18, he was 19. And we did get married decently young, 24 and 25. And granted, we did wait a long time to have our daughter. So we had a good chunk of time there to focus on our careers where we didn't have that level of responsibility outside of the workplace. But for me personally, my husband is, a huge reason why I'm at where I'm at now. So he is one of the grittiest, most goal-oriented, determined people I've ever met. And I wasn't necessarily that way. And I remember actually being really almost jealous of him, I guess, in a way, because he knew exactly what he wanted to do and he was going to do whatever it took to get there. And I'm actually kind of surprised you haven't asked about the craziness behind me, but he works in professional baseball. And so that was his goal. And he, when he basically found out he wasn't going to be able to pitch in the major leagues, he needed to figure out some other way to make it into baseball. And so he did. And so I got to watch and witness that journey and that determination and the, making opportunities where none existed. And we have a saying between the two of us that luck is just preparation meeting opportunity. So making sure that on our end we're prepared, we're doing the best we can, we're working hard, establishing good relationships with the people we work with, and so on and so forth. And so I've literally just been able to witness this incredible, gritty, determined, goal-oriented person, and it's hard for that to not rub off, right? And so he really inspired me with a lot of different things. And one of my favorite parts about him is he'll call me out, right? So I mentioned the fixed mindset and the growth mindset earlier. If I'm stuck in that fixed mindset spiral, he will just straight on call me up. I mean, in a loving way, in a very loving way. But I remember there was a time I had a little bout with trail running, and I was not doing well. I was kind of complaining about it. And he said, well, can you or can't you? I mean, simple, right? But also feel very called out. But then after that, actually, I trained and ran 2 half marathons, and that because of him, right? Just can I or can't I? Can I or can't? And what side do I want to be on? And then I had a position for a little while that I knew I wasn't going to do overly well in because it was sales oriented, and that's just not my expertise. And he said, I get it. This is it's a role that you're maybe not necessarily going to make the playoffs, right? Because he's putting everything in sports. And so, I mean, he was able to push me in areas and make sure, I was looking at things from an analytical lens or level-headed lens, but then also push me to not just do my best, but to do better. And so he's been a huge inspiration and a big reason why I am where I am, why I completed a doctorate, everything. I mean, he's just been so supportive. And so I've always said, a lot of people have asked me for marriage advice for some reason. And my biggest piece of advice is find someone who makes you better. Your spouse should make you better.
They become your pillar of strength, and then you banter back and forth with ideas and you both build each other up, you lift one another up. And that's why I think it is important to take time, right? To learn about somebody. Are they the right person for you? And, what's that age old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Very, very true. You can really go the distance with a loved one who is the right one for you, right? You don't want somebody obviously that will put you down, because it does. I personally feel that it amplifies almost your career trajectory, because you're there to push one another. You're in the race together. It's sort of a little random question I like to ask, because people are in many different industries that I talk to. At any given moment in time, how many tabs do you have open on your computer?
Oh, it's funny you asked that, because in your email you had said something about making sure this was the only thing you had open. So I had to go close out my tab, and I'm pretty sure I had 15 to 18 maybe.
Most people I've seen on average are like in that realm. There have been some outliers that are like 40 to 60. And it also depends on to like how many monitors somebody works on. Like I have 2 monitors, but some people have had 3 or 4 just on their setup. But yeah, I love asking that question. And then just for any listeners today, like what are some apps or plugins or software that you currently use in your day-to-day life that either optimize or make your life a little bit easier?
Yes. So I am usually an early adopter. I love anything that can make something more efficient. Sign me up. I will say, though, I was very slow to embrace AI. And I think a big part of that was because I love writing. I just finished a dissertation. So I had some hesitancy around that, especially in the academic world. But I have recently learned to embrace AI. And so there's all different kinds, right? So ChatGPT can definitely be helpful for, trying to name things. Like in higher ed, we have programs that we're trying to name or whatever, right? So it's how do we create something catchy? So ChatGPT can be really helpful with that. But I also just recently learned about magical AI, which can help you. So essentially, if there's an email you tend to send over and over and over again, you can type it out in magical AI. You have a special tag that, as long as you're using it in a browser, as opposed to the Outlook app on your computer. So as long as you're using it in the browser, You can type the tag, it pops up. You have little, I don't know what they'd be called, but like little fields essentially that you've pre-created where, hey, it prompts you to swap out where it says first name, for example, or whatever. So that has been really helpful because a lot of times, I'm trying to send the same email to a bunch of people, but I don't necessarily want to just blast everybody with an email with 50 people on it. Try and make it a little bit more personalized, but oh my word, I was able to, I think I knocked out maybe 20 or 25 emails in 2 minutes. It was amazing. So magical AI.
Definitely does help. I haven't heard of that one before, so I'm definitely going to check it out. But that's why I love asking these types of questions because they're just short, sweet, to the point, but it helps other people if they watch a lot of the episodes just to hear what others are using within their day-to-day life. And eventually I'll probably come out with some large summary of all the things that people utilize in their day-to-day activities. But I appreciate you answering that. And then just as we round out, I wanted to ask one final question. As someone who is reluctant to college life, but then you embraced it entirely, right? But you're also now like a conductor of student success or amplifying their career paths. What is one final thing that you would love young professionals to know so that they can set themselves up for success?
I love this question. Get started early. And so what I mean by that is don't wait until senior year to say, oh, I need to get a job now. And then you go to career services saying, hey, I need help writing a resume. Okay, what have you been doing for the last 4 years? Playing video games or whatever, and I've had that conversation more times than I care to count. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be, oh, I need to go get an internship or I need to go do this or that or the next thing. But as we talked about earlier, there are so many incredible ways to get involved. Get involved in something bigger than yourself. Push yourself out of your comfort zone, challenge yourself, try new things. And yes, have conversations early with career services about trying to figure out either where you're trying to go, or if you already know where you're trying to go, work with them to figure out actionable steps you can take to help you get there sooner. So, for example, if somebody's considering going on to medical school, that's something you need to start working with the pre-health advisor or the career services office or however it's structured at the school your first year, because there are certain things you have to do in order to get your application ready if you're going to apply before you graduate. So if the goal is to go straight from undergrad to medical school or whatever the case is, unless you get started early, you're going to end up taking a gap year. But if you're not thinking grad school, if you're thinking about just going into the workforce, again, if you can gain experience while you're still in college, those are the things that are either going to help you be able to negotiate for more money for a salary or be able to enter a position higher than an entry-level position. Plus, if you do an internship, you have a network. It's basically a long extended interview, right? They get to see you and your work ethic and skills and value you can bring and all those fun things. They get to witness it in person for however long, or I guess virtually, because some internships are virtual these days. But so they have the opportunity to see you and your work ethic and what you can produce, and the likelihood that they'll help you get something increases. So yes, ideally it would be great for something to turn into a full-time position from an internship. But even if they can't, sometimes they can refer you to other people. That's actually, I know we're running out of time, but a real quick story about my husband. So he wanted to go into baseball. He's a physical therapist, and he was in a sports residency trying to get into a baseball fellowship. And he interviewed for one at Ohio State. It was the first year they were launching it. And he didn't get it and was absolutely crushed. They ended up going with an internal Ohio State person. And so he was crushed. And so here we are, we're thinking about how do we move forward. And literally out of the blue, a few weeks later, he gets a phone call from the Ohio State people saying, I'm sorry we weren't able to take you, but there's this fellowship out of South Carolina. They're looking for somebody, and we just referred you for it.
Wow.
Right? So even sometimes if they can't do it for you, they'll at least get you connected with other people who can help you. And I think that's actually another really important lesson to learn is for the most part, people want to help. So ask.
Absolutely. And if you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit, please feel free to do so, because when we're in that phase of life, we're nervous to ask for help. But as we kind of grow up and we get into higher roles and we take on more leadership, we know how to ask for help or assistance. But it's important for the younger generation to learn that, because I think there's a big movement on independence. I have to be independent. I got to do things myself. I got to, hide my feelings, my emotions, whatever it might be. But then that makes people very recluse and not want to step out and ask for help. So, do you have any words of advice just on how people can maybe get comfortable with asking for help?
So honestly, it's very similar to what I spoke about earlier related to public speaking. You just have to do it. Honestly, you just have to do it. And if you need to warm up to it, start by asking for small things. But really, what I've learned, so many people, well, actually, I learned this from somebody who runs a leadership program for our honor students. She said, nobody makes it to where they are by themselves. Everybody has had somebody else help them. Everybody. Even if they don't want to admit it, they've had somebody help them. And so oftentimes what happens is those people want to pay it forward. And so when you reach out to somebody on LinkedIn to connect or network or at an event or something like that, most likely they're excited to help. And if they can't, they will tell you. And most of the time it's just because, their schedule's not going to work or they have too much on their plate or whatever the case may be, but they'll tell you. And I cannot emphasize enough, most of the time people truly want to help. So don't be afraid to ask. The worst thing that can happen is they don't respond or they say no.
It's the worst thing. You get a no, but it's not a big deal at all. And I think it relates back to your point you're touching on about get started early, right? One, that point alone helps you avoid procrastination, which is good to learn because you don't want to do things last minute. But if college students are active on LinkedIn currently, right? Showcase your work. Now's the best time to become and position yourself as an industry expert, because people will see your posts and then engage on LinkedIn, right? Connect with people, start building that network. Like you said, maybe not your first year in college, but at the same time, why not? Walk people through your journey. People will see you active on there. They'll see your work and your expertise, but there's so much they can share, right? From what they're learning in classes, learning within groups of friends, and then reach out to people. Start saying, hey, I'm in the healthcare space. I'd love to learn from you. Do you have 5 minutes for coffee? Let me ask you one question, and people will give back because they're at that stage. But when you get further along in your career, it becomes a little bit more challenging because now you're sort of meant to be, quote unquote, the industry expert. So why are you asking questions? To a certain degree, obviously you have your mentors above you, but yeah, so I appreciate you touching on that because it's very important for them to know and understand.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Marette, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely a wonderful conversation, and I know that you are a catalyst for student success. So appreciate you spending your time and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was lovely. I appreciate it.